Welcome to Life Stories. Today, we have an inspiring story about Jessica, a woman who's been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, juggling family responsibilities and financial struggles alone. But everything changes when she meets Robert, a man who offers more than just support. He offers understanding, empathy, and a chance at something more. Follow Jessica's journey as she learns to let go, trust someone else, and maybe, just maybe, discover love in the process. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to start today's heartwarming story. I've always been the kind of person who doesn't believe in fate. And certainly not in blind dates. To me, they were an unnecessary risk. A gamble where I would be left wondering what I was doing there and why I even bothered. My best friend, Sarah, didn't share this view. She was the romantic type. The one who believed in destiny. In that electric spark that could light up the world the moment two souls connected. I suppose in the past, I had been more about numbers, deadlines, and making sure I survived another day at the office, rather than believing in any sort of magic. That said, after much coaxing and several phone calls from Sarah, I finally agreed to give it a go. One night, no strings, just to see what all the fuss was about. I figured if nothing else, it would make for a good story. And that was how. Despite all my hesitations, I found myself standing outside a posh restaurant in downtown Chicago, a few minutes early for what promised to be the most awkward evening of my life. The cold air of the city brushed against my skin, and the hum of city traffic seemed so distant in my ears. I smoothed down the navy blue shift dress I was wearing, taking a deep breath. Nerves started to settle in despite my best efforts to keep composed. I wasn't used to feeling anxious like this. I was good at keeping up appearances, at making sure everything appeared in order. But that evening, standing on the plush red carpet inside the restaurant, I felt out of place. Like I didn't belong. It smelled of expensive wine and roasted meats. It was the kind of place I could never quite imagine myself frequenting. I glanced around, trying to calm the growing butterflies in my stomach. And then, I saw him, Robert Hayes. He sat at a corner table, looking out at the glittering skyline. Tall, well-groomed, with a sharp suit that somehow made him look even more powerful than he already was. I had never believed in those so-called moments of connection that people talk about. But the moment our eyes locked, something inside me shifted. It wasn't just his striking looks or his evident wealth that caught my attention, it was the way he carried himself. It was as if he belonged in this world. And that feeling, that quiet confidence, was almost intimidating. I hesitated for a moment, my stomach flipping as if warning me to back away. What was I doing here? He looked like someone who had everything together. Someone who didn't need someone like me in his life. I stood there for a moment, trying to collect myself, but before I could overthink it, Robert turned and caught my eye. His lips curved into a knowing smile. Not a cocky grin, but a small, confident smile that, for some reason, made my heart race. Jessica? His voice was calm, smooth, almost a little deeper than I had expected. It was warm, inviting. My pulse quickened, and I blinked, suddenly realizing that I had been staring. I nodded, managing a weak, "Yes, that's me," as I crossed the room toward him. "Come sit down," he said, his hand extending in greeting. I took it, and was surprised by the warmth and firmness of his grip. I couldn't help but feel an odd mix of nervousness and intrigue. This was it, the start of a night I had no idea how to handle. As I took my seat across from him, the waiter appeared, ready to take our orders. Robert ordered a bottle of wine with ease. He wasn't just ordering wine, he was commanding the situation. I, on the other hand, felt the need to retreat a little. I rarely drank, let alone drink expensive wine. So I simply asked for a glass of water instead. It felt safer. Robert didn't seem to notice my unease. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on me, and the conversation began effortlessly. "Tell me about yourself. What do you do when you're not on blind dates?" he asked casually, his voice warm with genuine curiosity. "I'm an executive assistant," I replied, trying to sound confident, though inside, I felt anything but. I've been working in the city for a few years. Not the most exciting job. But it pays the bills. The words left my mouth before I could stop them. The truth was, I didn't really believe in big dreams anymore. My world was about schedules, to-do lists, and making sure my family's financial problems didn't consume me. Robert smiled, his eyes twinkling with amusement. I wouldn't say it's not exciting. You must be good at it if you're working here in the city. His compliment, though casual, made me feel something I didn't expect, seen. I hadn't been seen like this in a while. Not by someone who wasn't family or an old friend. I try, I said, almost laughing at myself. It's all about making sure the wheels keep turning. I guess. He nodded thoughtfully, taking a sip from his wine glass. I know the feeling, he said, his tone softening. In my world, it's all about managing chaos. But it has its perks. He flashed me another smile. One that seemed to light up his entire face. It was charming, effortless, and for the first time that evening, I felt myself relax, just a little. The night moved on, and the awkwardness of a blind date began to fade. Robert's charisma made it easy to talk, to share things I rarely talked about. He listened intently, asking questions without interrupting, genuinely interested in my answers. It wasn't just small talk. There was something else in his eyes, a depth, a quiet empathy that I wasn't used to encountering. As the evening wore on, he asked, "What's something you've always wanted to do but never had the chance?" I paused. That question was different. People always asked about my career, my next steps, but no one ever asked about dreams, real dreams. Not the ones I kept buried deep inside. I've always wanted to travel more, I admitted, my voice softer now. I never get the time to do it. And when I do, it always feels impossible. Maybe someday. But, I trailed off, unsure if I even believed my own words. Robert studied me for a moment. His expression thoughtful. "Maybe someday could be sooner than you think," he said quietly, his gaze intense. His words sent a shiver down my spine. And for a second, I wondered if I was imagining something more between us. Before I could respond, the waiter returned with our meals. And the moment passed. We both shifted our focus to the food. But there was an unspoken connection that hung between us. I hadn't expected to feel at ease with a man like him. But there I was, laughing and talking as though I had known him for years. When the evening drew to a close, Robert insisted on walking me out. And despite my initial hesitation, I agreed. The night air was cool against my skin as we stepped out onto the bustling streets of Chicago. The city alive around us. I smiled softly, though there was still a feeling of unease bubbling within me. I was standing outside my comfort zone. And it scared me. "You're quiet all of a sudden," Robert remarked, his voice warm. "Penny for your thoughts?" I laughed softly, trying to shake off the weight of the night. Just thinking about how I never thought I'd be on a date like this. I said honestly. Robert chuckled, his smile widening. "I get that," he said. "I don't usually do blind dates either. But I'm glad I made an exception tonight." "Me too," I replied, surprised at how genuine the words felt. As Robert stepped closer, I caught a fleeting look in his eyes. For a moment, his gaze dropped to my lips before he leaned in. Just enough to place a quick kiss on my cheek. It was soft, fleeting, but it lingered in a way I hadn't expected. "Good night, Jessica," he said softly, his voice carrying a promise. "I'll call you." And with that, he walked away. I stood still for a moment, watching him disappear into the night. My thoughts swirling. I had no idea where this night would lead. But for the first time in a long time, I was willing to find out. The days following the blind date with Robert felt strange. There was something about that evening. Something in the way he made me feel seen and valued. That lingered long after I had returned to my usual routine. Life didn't pause. After all, the pressure of my family's mounting debts continued to weigh on me. Every day was a delicate balance between keeping my job together and trying to manage the financial crisis at home. The constant calls from creditors. The threats from the bank. Everything felt like a storm I was desperately trying to weather alone. I hadn't shared much about my situation with Robert. I had barely shared it with anyone. My family's financial troubles were a burden I had carried alone for years. They were mine to solve. And I wasn't about to burden anyone else with them, especially not someone like Robert. He had his life, his world, and I was a part of neither. But he didn't give up on reaching out. Robert called me the next day. Much to my surprise, he had been so charming on our date. So easy to talk to. I had expected him to move on, to forget about me, but instead, he invited me for coffee, asking if we could meet up again. The idea of seeing him again both comforted and unnerved me. He was different, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. There was a kindness in him, an empathy, that I wasn't used to receiving from people. We met at a small, cozy cafe, the kind with big windows that let you watch the world go by. I walked in, and there he was, sitting by the window, absorbed in his phone. Even in a casual setting like this, Robert had an air of quiet confidence. He looked up when he saw me, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Jessica," he said, his voice warm, "you look beautiful today." I was taken aback. I hadn't expected that. A blush crept up my neck as I fumbled for a reply. "Thanks," I managed, trying to sound casual. "You look relaxed." He chuckled. "I do try to mix things up now and then," he teased, his eyes twinkling with a mischief that made me laugh. We spent the next few hours chatting. Just two people getting to know one another. But the conversation eventually turned to more personal topics. He asked me how work was going, how everything in my life was going. I hesitated. I didn't want to unload my burdens onto him. But there was something about the way he looked at me, like he genuinely cared, that made me open up more than I had intended. "My family's been going through a lot lately," I confessed, my voice quieter now. "My parents, they've fallen behind on bills. I've been trying to help them get back on track. But it's a lot. The debt is huge, and the creditors don't exactly give us any breathing room." His eyes softened as I spoke. And for the first time in a long while, I felt vulnerable. It wasn't like me to admit that I wasn't in control, to share the weight of my struggles with anyone. But somehow, Robert made it feel safe to do so. His voice was steady when he spoke. "You're carrying all of that on your shoulders alone?" he asked gently. I nodded, looking down at my coffee. It was hard to admit the truth, even to myself, but I had to. Robert leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "I'm sorry, Jessica, that sounds really tough, but you don't have to do this alone. You know." His words hit me like a ton of bricks. He was offering help, and, in that moment, my first instinct was to reject it. To tell him that I didn't need help. I had never been good at accepting assistance from anyone. It felt like weakness, like I was admitting defeat. "I appreciate the offer, Robert," I said, my voice tight, "but I'm fine. I can handle it." There was a long silence between us. Robert's gaze didn't waver, and I could see the disappointment flicker in his eyes. But he didn't push. He sat back in his chair and gave me a small, understanding smile. "I get it," he said softly, "but if you change your mind, I'm here." The conversation moved on to safer ground after that. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Robert had been kind, but he hadn't judged me. He saw the cracks in my armor, the ones I tried so hard to hide. And he didn't turn away. He was offering me something, support, understanding, but I was too scared to accept it. I wasn't ready to let someone in. Not yet. As we finished our coffee and parted ways, I walked back to my apartment, my thoughts consumed by everything I had just said, and by the offer Robert had made. It felt like a lifeline. And yet, I wasn't ready to grab it. The next few days felt like a blur. I tried to keep everything together, but my mind kept drifting back to the coffee date with Robert. His words kept replaying in my head, and the more I thought about them, the more I realized how much I needed someone. I had always prided myself on being strong, on handling everything on my own. I didn't want to admit that I was struggling, especially not to someone like Robert. But the pressure was mounting. The calls from creditors were growing more insistent. the letters piling up. My family's situation seemed to be spiraling out of control. And no matter how much I tried, I couldn't seem to fix it. The weight of it all was suffocating. I spent most of my days pretending everything was fine. But at night, the reality would crash down on me. I couldn't do it alone anymore. That was when I finally made the decision. I had to reach out. I had to let someone help me, even if it meant admitting that I couldn't handle everything on my own. The thought of asking Robert for help made me feel both relieved and terrified. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that he had been nothing but kind and patient with me. Maybe it was time to trust him. I picked up the phone one afternoon, my fingers trembling as I scrolled through my contacts. His name was there, just a tap away. I hesitated for a moment, my thumb hovering over the screen. I almost put the phone down. But then I took a deep breath and sent the message. I need help, I typed. Can we talk? The moment I hit send, my heart skipped a beat. I immediately regretted it, but before I could talk myself out of it, the 3 dots appeared on the screen, indicating that he was typing. My breath caught in my chest as I waited, anxiety rising in my stomach. A few minutes later, his response came. I'm here, Jessica. Let's talk tomorrow. I'll make time. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I wasn't alone. Robert was there, and he was offering to help without hesitation. The next day, I met him at a quiet restaurant. The kind that felt intimate and comforting. I hadn't been sure what I was expecting, but seeing Robert sitting there, waiting for me, made everything feel a little less overwhelming. He stood up when he saw me, greeting me with a smile that somehow reassured me. Jessica, I'm glad you came, he said softly. You don't have to do this alone anymore. I sat down across from him, my hands slightly trembling. There was so much I wanted to say. But where would I even begin? How could I explain everything, the guilt, the fear, the feeling of helplessness I had been carrying for so long? Robert must have sensed my hesitation, because he didn't rush me. Instead, he leaned forward and gave me his full attention. Take your time, he said gently. Tell me what's going on. And so I did. For the first time, I let it all out, the weight of my family's debt. The constant calls from creditors. The sleepless nights I spent wondering how I was going to fix everything. I explained how I had been juggling all of this on my own, trying to protect my family and keep everything together, even when it felt like I was falling apart. Robert listened intently, never interrupting, just letting me speak. When I finished, there was a long pause. I felt vulnerable, exposed, but Robert didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with understanding. You don't have to carry this burden alone, Jessica, he said softly. I'm here for you. Let me help. The words hit me harder than I had expected. Let him help. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. He was offering me something I had never allowed myself to accept: support, understanding, and maybe even more. I don't know how to accept this, I whispered, my voice breaking. I've always had to fix everything on my own. It feels wrong to rely on someone else. Robert reached across the table, placing his hand gently on mine. It's not about fixing everything, he said. It's about standing with you. You don't have to do this alone anymore. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. I realized that letting someone in didn't make me weak. It made me human. It was okay to need help. It was okay to lean on someone else. Robert was right. I didn't have to carry the weight of the world by myself. As I looked into his eyes, I knew I had made the right choice. I didn't have to handle everything alone anymore. I had someone by my side. Someone who cared about me enough to help me through the hardest time of my life. The days that followed my decision to finally accept Robert's help felt different. For the first time in so long, the weight on my shoulders seemed a little lighter. I still had a long road ahead with my family's debts, but at least I wasn't carrying it all alone. Robert's presence in my life had begun to change things in ways I hadn't expected. I found myself looking forward to our conversations. Whether it was about my family, work, or life in general, it felt like I was beginning to breathe again. Robert didn't pressure me. He didn't try to solve everything for me. He offered his help and advice. But he also gave me the space to process everything at my own pace. His calmness, his unwavering support, it was exactly what I needed. Every time we spoke, I felt like I could let go of a little more of the fear and anxiety that had consumed me for so long. One evening, as we sat across from each other at a small restaurant near the water, I realized something. We had been talking for hours, but the conversation had changed. It wasn't just about my family's situation anymore. It was about us. There was a comfort between us that I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge before. Robert's presence felt familiar, like he was no longer just someone who had helped me through a tough time. He was someone who had become a part of my life. Someone I was beginning to care about. As we shared a quiet moment, the weight of everything else seemed to disappear. We talked about travel, about places we both wanted to visit. And somehow, in the middle of that casual conversation, there was a shift. The way Robert looked at me, the way his smile softened when our eyes met, it was clear that there was something more between us than just kindness or support. "I've always wanted to go to Italy," I said, my voice carrying a hint of wistfulness. "I've heard it's beautiful there. The history, the art, the food. It seems like the perfect place to escape to, even if just for a little while." Robert's eyes sparkled, and he smiled that smile of his, the one that made my heart flutter. "Italy, huh? Maybe we'll take a trip there someday," he said, his voice filled with a quiet promise. The words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to dream again. A future, a possibility, where I wasn't alone in the struggle. As the evening continued, I found myself wondering if this was what I had been missing all along. I had spent so much time holding everything together, building walls around myself to protect my heart. But Robert had managed to break through those walls. Not with force, but with patience, kindness, and a deep understanding that made me feel safe in a way no one else ever had. We finished dinner and walked along the shoreline, the sound of the water gently lapping against the shore. It was late, and the city lights reflected in the water, creating a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. As we stood there, looking out at the skyline, Robert turned to me, his expression softening. "Jessica," he said quietly, his voice carrying a hint of something deeper than I had heard before. "I don't just want to be the guy who helped you through this. I want more than that. I care about you. I want to be with you. Not just for a few months, but for the long haul. I want us to build something real." His words took me by surprise. I had known that there was a connection between us, but hearing him say it out loud, in such an honest, vulnerable way, left me speechless. My heart raced as I looked up at him, unsure of how to respond. I had been so focused on surviving, on managing my family's crisis, that I hadn't allowed myself to think about anything else. But standing there with Robert, the possibilities seemed endless. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I could have a future with him. Maybe I didn't need to keep running from what I felt. Maybe it was okay to let someone in. Maybe, just maybe, I could have both love and stability. Something I had never thought possible. "I've been scared too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Scared of what this means. Scared of letting myself need someone. But I want it. Robert, I want to take this chance with you." A smile spread across his face, gentle and full of warmth. "Then let's do it together," he said, his words a promise. "We don't have to do this alone." And in that moment, something shifted inside me. For the first time in years, I felt the possibility of a future that didn't revolve around struggle, fear, and control. It felt like I was finally allowing myself to live, to embrace the future with someone who truly cared about me, who saw me for who I was and accepted me with all my flaws and uncertainties. The journey ahead would be challenging, but I knew one thing for certain: I wouldn't have to face it alone. As the weeks passed, Robert and I grew even closer. The weight of my family's financial troubles didn't vanish overnight, but with his help, I was able to breathe again. It wasn't just the practical support he offered, his understanding, his patience, and the way he always made me feel valued made all the difference. Slowly, the storm in my life began to calm. The creditors stopped calling, and the heavy pressure that had once consumed me started to lift. But more than that, Robert taught me something I hadn't understood before: how to let go, how to trust, and how to be vulnerable without feeling weak. He had shown me that accepting help didn't mean I was failing, it meant I was human. And in learning to lean on him, I discovered a love that was steady, patient, and real. Together, we navigated the highs and lows of life, always by each other's side. I realized that the future wasn't something to be feared, but something to be built together. No longer did I have to carry the weight alone. Robert had become my partner in every sense of the word. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was living, not just surviving. As I stood next to him, looking out over the horizon, I felt a peace I had never known before. The journey had been long, but it had brought me to a place where I could finally trust, love, and, most importantly, let someone else in. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more life-changing stories. We're excited to bring you more heartwarming tales. So stay tuned for the next video.